Welcome to my live feed here while I continue to present a presentation that has been presented. Let's begin once more. Get everything set up here. I'll have a chat available here. I'm just gonna hit play here and
Hey folks, great to be here. First time in W. It's a bloody long way from Sydney. But at least I've shaved 4 hours off the journey home, right? So, every cloud. So, the presentation I've got for you this evening is loosely titled Music's Mind Control and Military Connections. Don't pay too much attention to the word presentation. Just notice there's a literal in there. Misspelt it, but anyway. Here arises the first question of the evening. Why should there be any kind of connection at all between music, mind control, and the military? If music is all about harmless fun and entertainment, letting your hair down after a long, hard week at work, going out and listening to a favourite band, listening to a favourite album at home, you know, that's the way we're trained to think as of popular music as being there for. But the truth of the matter is rather more insidious, as we'll see as we progress. Many of you might be familiar with my background, which is as a club and radio DJ. I did this for 20 years as my full-time job. I came to Australia 6 times actually, between 2003 and 2009, played a whole bunch of gigs. It was mainly in Sydney, Brisbane and Melbourne, so I never made it out these sides. This is me 20 years ago in front of the Sydney Harbour Bridge. I've hardly changed, I know. So this was a flyer that I knocked up for these shows. So I did that job for a great many years, and during that time the only things that really mattered to me were the next gig, the next party, the next tune. I enjoyed travelling, but it was just all about clubs and gigs and music for me. But round about 2007 I started to have some big questions about what was really going on in the world and what the true nature of this place was in the first place. So pretty much the biggest questions you can have: what are we doing here? What's the end goal of it all? What is this place?
what is this place? The end goal.
I got put onto the of David Icke by my dad, who had been reading them, and at the time I was of the same opinion as most.
I'm gonna catch up to where I left off earlier.
Name has been placed there by those who can make make these careers happen. They don't happen on your terms, they happen on theirs. And there's always a price to pay, and it can never be worth it. And when it comes to how this group got their success, maybe here we've got another clue. Because these so-called elite controllers and their assets do like to place the truth in plain sight, and they do like to use signs, symbols and occult ways of signalling. And what we're looking at here is another one of those. So Lennon and McCartney, that's McCartney 1.0, we'll get to that, have their hands inside their jackets at home, the picture. When it comes to the Beatles and their extended story, there is quite a high body count, it turns out. Here are two pictures of Paul with his girlfriend Jane Asher. Anyone notice any discrepancies? So over on the right we've got the original Paul, and over on the left we've got the replacement. Look at how he's towering above Jane in height, whereas originally they were roughly the same height. So what the hell am I talking about here? Well, this is one of the most popular conspiracy theories within music. The idea that the guy we have today, who is on Australian shores as I speak, I believe. I think he was playing in Brizzy last night, so we missed each other, fortunately. I thought he might sneak in the back of my gig, but I was in Sydney, so that's all good. So it's not until you place these photos side by side that you start to see the differences. So if you passed either of those photos to the average person and said, who's this? They'd say, well, it's Paul McCartney. But you put them side by side and then you start to go, wow, can that possibly be the same guy? So the idea is, and it's a very popular one within research circles, that the original Paul McCartney was killed in a car crash in 1966. The date which is given for this is the 11th of September 9/11 of 66. This idea is explored in this book which appeared in 2009. It's credited to an author and an encoder by the name of Thomas E. U. Harriot. It's called The Memoirs of Billy Shears, and it purports to be the tell-all autobiography of the individual who's been playing the public role of Paul McCartney from 1966 to this day. The book is heavily coded, heavily cryptic, very cleverly written. It contains a lot of inside knowledge of the Beatles' business. It contains a lot of occult, arcane, esoteric knowledge. And it reveals a great many things. There have been many different versions of it, but the account is that the individual playing the role of Paul McCartney was originally named William Shepherd, nicknamed Billy Shepherd or Billy Shears. So on the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band album, at the end of the opening track, when you get the lyric, "May I introduce to you the one and only Billy Shears," that's supposed to be the public's first introduction to the new guy who's replaced the original Paul who went in 1966. This book does make for quite a disturbing read because it talks about Paul's death having been a ritual sacrifice. So it was dressed up to be a car accident, but it was no accident at all. Actually, he was taken out as part of some sick ritual in line with the belief system that the dark occultists have, because that's what they are. Those who preside over the music industry, the Hollywood film industry, television, the world of big business, science, medicine, politics, whatever it is, are ultimately dark occultists. Satanists, Luciferians, they adhere to their ritualistic practices, and it doesn't matter whether anyone believes it or thinks it's a load of nonsense, they believe it and they stick very rigidly to it. We have had quite a few clues over the years to the idea that this guy we have today is not the original Paul McCartney, but is actually a guy named Billy. There are many examples. I've got just a couple for you here. So what we're going to look at first is an event attended by McCartney, also Olivia Harrison, who is George Harrison's widow, and their son Danny. So take a look at how Olivia greets Paul. Let's see if we can get some sound. What are we? So we should have some sound there. Okay, let me play that again. You probably saw the caption anyway, but it's always good to hear it. Should we try again? Well, it was working in the test, wasn't it? Should I check the sound settings on the laptop? Okay, excuse me. We do want to get this operating properly, so it's probably worth just doing this. We thought we were wired, but no, something's changed. Okay. Something's changed there. Okay, so let's try it again. I think this time we might have the sound with a bit of luck. Here we go. Fingers crossed.
What's it like to do what? It's lovely. Excuse me, I've got to say hello to my friend. Hello. You all right? Thank you.
All right, so that's one such example. If it was an isolated incident, somebody might try.
Album 1980 and the song Tug of War, and I said, you know that lyric in the chorus, one day we'll stand up on top of the mountain with our flag unfurled, but it won't be soon enough. And he just lit up. He did up. Oh, that was a song, you know. I just pictured a big flag, you know, up on the top of a mountain, you know. And then that was it. That was it. We were fast friends after that. So I think with Billy, people like it if you take one of his obscure songs or obscure album and be very specific.
Yeah, right. So he's talking about Paul McCartney, and then he says, oh, I think with Billy. Well, who the fuck's Billy then if he's talking about Paul? So, yeah. Any of you familiar with the work of Mike Williams, known as Sage of Quay? Few of you, yeah? Mike has done an incredible deep dive into the story of the Beatles and the idea of the McCartney replacement. He's got hours and hours of material on his channel. I thoroughly recommend a look at sageofquay.com. That's spelled Quay, like the word key. He's got a YouTube channel, and he's got other channels for the stuff that YouTube bans. And he has done more work than anyone to expose this guy, Billy Shepherd, Billy Shears, and he really goes into the occult aspects of this story as well. During 2020, Mike put out a 4.5-hour documentary, so he made very good use of his lockdown time, asking whether it's actually possible that Lennon and McCartney can have written all the songs that they're credited with during the period that the Beatles were producing their Rubber Soul album, 1965. So Mike has broken down what each of those band members was doing, according to official records, during this particular period when that album was being produced. And he's shown that it's physically impossible for them to have written and recorded and produced all those songs by themselves in that time period. There has to have been help from other uncredited parties. And if that's the case with one small period in the Beatles' history, it's probably the case with their entire career. So I definitely recommend a look at that one for anyone that wants a deeper dive into this story. We have to talk about Scarsdale. This is a relatively obscure town in Westchester County, New York State. This is the town the family of Yoko Ono spent some time when Yoko's father, who headed up a Japanese banking conglomerate, went over the United States to base himself there. So he went over with a young Yoko, and the family spent some time in Scarsdale. On the subject of Yoko, many researchers feel that she fulfilled the role of John Lennon's mind control handler. So what you often find with handlers is that they're romantic partners or spouses. So they're inserted into these artists' lives to keep an eye on them and make sure they don't stray too far off script. So Lennon had a very strange relationship with Yoko. He used to call her mother. She was quite a bit older than him. And John Lennon had quite a few mother issues, some sort of hang-ups, resulting from the fact that his mother was killed when he was 14 years of age, when she got mown down in a car driven by an off-duty policeman. Paul McCartney's mother died when he was 15, so both of them suffered similar trauma at roughly the same age, and this is a very common factor. The interesting thing about Yoko's mother is that she is descended from the one-time emperor of Japan. So Yoko isn't just anyone. She comes from Japanese royalty. And I believe she was inserted into John Lennon's world at a time when he was becoming a bit unreliable, a bit erratic. He was entering into his period of political activism, and it was felt that he had to be kept on a tighter leash. So that's how she came into the picture. Also in Scarsdale, there was a young woman by the name of Linda Eastman, or to give her the original family name, Linda Epstein. So her father was a Lithuanian Jew by the name of Leopold von Epstein. And he relocated to the United States, changed his name to Lee Eastman to sound more American. And of course, Linda Eastman became Linda McCartney when she married Paul. She spent her formative years in Scarsdale, went to high school there, grew up there. So we have two women who went on to marry the two most prolific singer-songwriters of the 20th century, both growing up in the same town in New York State. What are the odds of that happening randomly. Several billion to one, I would suggest. So there's obviously something more to know about Scarsdale and what goes on there. Many famous people have come out of Scarsdale, including Liza Minnelli and the actor Noah Schnapp, best known for his role in Stranger Things. Stranger Things indeed. And finally, before we leave the Beatles, going back to the so-called fifth Beatle, Sir George Martin. We should count them, shouldn't we? How many sirs? We should have a drinking game where every time I mention a sir, you take a swig of a liquor of your choice. You'll all be on the floor by the end of the evening, trust me. So Martin was a musical genius. He's credited with having produced all those amazing Beatles albums in the second part of their career when they became a studio band and stopped touring. Incidentally, the very last official Beatles gig was on the 28th of August 1966 in Candlestick Park, San Francisco. And we're told that McCartney died on the 11th of September, just a few days later. So it is interesting that the Beatles stopped touring right before that date. Then they became a studio band. So George Martin, before he became the in-house producer at EMI Studios, had worked at the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. You know, those nice people at the BBC that tell us the truth all the time. Actually, the BBC is a state propaganda broadcasting arm of the UK government, heavily connected to MI5, MI6, and also Tavistock. It's a military intel operation. They had their radiophonic shop, and that's where they experimented with sound and frequencies and everything that could be achieved through them. So George Martin got his training there and then went on to work with the Beatles. Continuing with the theme of military connections to the world of music. How many people are familiar with this landmark piece of work by the author Dave McGowan? It's called Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon. Anyone read this? Only one. Okay. I usually do a show of hands at these gigs just to find out. A few people in Sydney had read it, but usually most people haven't. So this book appeared in 2014. It was written by David McGowan, and he was a builder. So his day job was in construction, but he was also a fan of 60s music. So he grew up in LA, and he was into many of the bands that came out of the so-called counterculture scene in the mid to late 1960s. So he went on holiday one time, and he had a book with him about Laurel Canyon, which is this neighborhood in the Hollywood Hills overlooking LA. And he came to realize that virtually all of the bands and the musicians that had shaped that counterculture, hippie, flower power, psychedelic scene in the mid to late 1960s had emerged out of Laurel Canyon. This was a very strange thing, because prior to the mid-60s, Laurel Canyon had no musical heritage whatsoever. There were no music clubs, no recording studios, no record labels, yet for some reason, bands from all over the United States were being drawn magnet-like to this one neighborhood. They were coming from Canada, people like Joni Mitchell, Neil Young, bands were coming from the UK even, like the Animals, all going and relocating to Laurel Canyon. One thing that place did have in it was a covert military research base known as Lookout Mountain. And that's where a bunch of government propaganda films were produced. And it involved many famous people in undercover positions being based there, including Marilyn Monroe, Walt Disney, James Stewart, Bob Hope, Ronald Reagan, and a whole load of others. So this piqued McGowan's interest, and he started delving much deeper into some of the backgrounds of these prominent bands and musicians. And what he discovered was that almost without exception, you found direct links, usually fathers, into the world of military. So the army, the navy, the air force, the marines, it could be expressions of government, the CIA, the FBI, Pentagon, Defense Department, all these things. Nobody's dad is ever a plumber, a lorry driver, or a docker. What you do find is generals, admirals, people of that nature. And the best example we have to illustrate the point is that of Jim Morrison, the frontman of The Doors, and his old man. So top we have a young James Douglas Morrison on the bridge of the ship that his father commanded. So that's his dad there on the right, Admiral George Stephen Morrison. His claim to fame is that he was the Navy admiral in charge of the fleet of ships involved in the Gulf of Tonkin false flag incident, which springboarded America into the Vietnam War. And yet you've got his son Jim heading up a group who are the poster children for this anti-war, anti-establishment generation. These were the baby boomers, so-called. These were the young people of the time. It's the generation born towards the end of the Second World War. They were coming of age in the mid to late 1960s, and they were having a major number done on them by the social engineers of the day. So Jim Morrison was, as the son of the Admiral, an actor. In that first picture of him, he's very clean cut, short hair, and you can find a video on YouTube of him doing a commercial for Florida State University. It's an acting role. He's there in his college blazer, he's got his books under his arm, and he's doing an ad for this university. A year later, he emerges as this fully formed rock god icon. He's up there on stage, getting naked, getting drunk, pushing LSD, pushing debaucherous behavior, and ostensibly standing for the direct opposite of the value system that his old man represents. And loads of people make excuses for him, and they say, oh, well, Jim was rebelling against his dad, and that's what young people do sometimes. He didn't approve of what he was into. And if this were an isolated story, maybe you could make the case for that. But what McGowan illustrated through his book was that it's far from an isolated case. He gives many examples. We'll just hone in on the father and papa star, John Phillips. He was a career Marine Corps officer, and his mother, sister, and first wife were all career employees of the Defense Department at the Pentagon. Furthermore, John Phillips's first wife, Susie Adams, was a direct descendant of John Adams, America's second president. Even Phillips himself went to West Point and was being prepped for a military career. Furthermore, John's first war from an isolated case was standing for the direct opposite of the value system that his old man represents.
I just want to highlight this moment on the video where he says it's a military operation. There's quite a few examples that I make it undeniable.
And loads of people make excuses for him, and they say, oh, well, Jim was rebelling against his dad, and that's what young people do sometimes. He didn't approve of what he was into. And if this were an isolated story, maybe you could make the case for that. But what McGowan illustrated through his book was that it's far from an isolated case. He gives many examples. We'll just hone in on father of the Mamas and Papas star, John Phillips. He was a career Marine Corps officer, and his mother, sister, and first wife were all career employees of the Defense Department at the Pentagon. Furthermore, John Phillips's first wife, Susie Adams, was a direct descendant of John Adams, America's second president. Even Phillips himself went to West Point and was being prepped for a military career. We can throw Frank Zappa into the mix as well. He was part of that Laurel Canyon crowd. They all resided in that area. Frank Zappa's father worked on biological weapons research at the Edgewood Arsenal military base. And yet Frank Zappa is thought of as an anti-establishment folk hero. He may well have rebelled against what his father was into because he died at the age of 53, relatively young. But in terms of so many of these other acts, we find these same connections through the fathers into these direct expressions of the military. A footnote on Dave McGowan. That book came out in 2014. I interviewed him that year, and it had a very profound effect on me because it set me off on a path of research, a style of research, which I still do now, which is delving into the family backgrounds and the affiliations of prominent celebrities. And when you do that, it's amazing what you find. So the book appeared in 2014. By the end of 2015, Dave McGowan was dead. So he passed away on the 22nd of November, the anniversary of the Kennedy assassination, and a date which we'll also be visiting in part 2 of an extremely aggressive and fast-acting form of cancer. Go figure. Anyway, he left behind an incredible legacy of work, and I'm extremely grateful for what he did leave behind, and I hope that in some small way I've picked up the baton and carried on with it. It wasn't just rock musicians who were the cultural heroes of that period in the 60s. Also in the mix, you had academics such as Dr. Timothy Leary. He's the guy who's credited with popularizing the slogan, turn on, tune in, drop out. Meaning, young people of the time don't bother contributing to society, don't bother getting involved in political causes or activism of any kind. Hey, just drop acid and get stoned, listen to psychedelic rock music and have wild sex and just chill out, man. So he was embracing the idea of young people, his students, going on these journeys of discovery, of exploring their consciousness through various entheogens or psychedelics. There were more natural ones, such as mescaline and peyote, psilocybin mushrooms, which were around at the time. But the main one that was being pushed was laboratory-produced LSD. And there's so much documentary evidence to prove beyond any doubt that the vast bulk of the LSD that was showing up at hippie music festivals in the 1960s and in all these communes was coming through CIA supply routes. Later in his career, Leary admitted to having been in the employ of the CIA. He was a CIA asset. So that whole agenda was designed to get the young people of the time hooked on acid and getting them away from any forms of activism while the Vietnam War was going on, and to stifle that anti-war movement of the time by creating a generation incapable of doing anything. We can also throw into the mix Gloria Steinem. So it was literally sex and drugs and rock and roll. Her role was as proprietor of Ms. magazine, and she was a pusher of modern feminism. The idea that females can do anything their male counterparts can, and hey sisters, it's time we stepped up and started getting involved in the same jobs as the men. And the idea was to get women into the workplace and away from their traditional nurturing role in the home, raising children, to get the children into state so-called care at ever younger ages, with the added benefit of more women in the workplace contributing further to the taxation system. So it's a win-win if you're a manipulative psychopath. And that's what it was all about, the breaking down of the traditional family unit, the cohesion and the unity that comes from the family. They wanted to destroy that. So it was new attitudes towards sex, towards relationships, towards drugs, towards music, and all of it was coming through the CIA. Oh, did I mention Gloria Steinem also turned out to be an asset of the CIA? All roads lead back to those fine folk who Americans believe are there to keep them safe from harm and represent their interests. But the truth of the matter, in this satanically inverted society in which we live, is the CIA are the one actually causing all the harm. And it's exactly the Britain with MI5 and MI6 and Tavistock. It'll be the same in Australia with whatever the equivalent is here. A band very much associated with that 60s counterculture and beyond were the Grateful Dead. Their fans always like to refer to themselves as deadheads. They think it's a term of endearment. Actually, it represents morbid, satanic mockery on the part of this band's controllers. That's the way they see the general public, as deadheads. They like to think of all of us as useless eaters, as profane, spiritually ignorant, and so they have their little in-jokes like that. When you go into the family backgrounds of the Grateful Dead members and some of their connections, it doesn't disappoint. So Bob Weir, one of the key members, is an attendee at Bohemian Grove, this area of redwood forest in California, where politicians and business leaders and the great and the good of the world meet once a year, dress up in robes and dance around a bonfire in front of a 40-foot stone owl. I mean, we've all done it. It's standard for the weekend, right? So that's how Bob Weir gets down. And with the other members of the group, you find connections into Freemasonry and the Century Club and Harvard and Yale University and aristocratic bloodline families and things of this nature. The Pentagon, different expressions of the government, it's all there. By the way, the one-time music publisher and road manager for the Grateful Dead was a dude by the name of Alan Trist. His father was Eric Trist, who was one of the founder members of the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations in London. Tavistock is, I would argue, the leading social engineering think tank which employs behavioural scientists, psychologists and anthropologists, those who know how the human psyche works and how it can be manipulated, and whose full-time job it is to create, shape and mould societal attitudes to affect the way people think about the world and the way they behave. And haven't we had a great example of that dynamic in action over the past 3.5 years? I would argue that the Convid PSYOP was in very large part cooked up on British shores in Tavistock and exported around the rest of the world. So, sorry about that. Not that it's anything to do with me. But that's what Tavistock is all about. Another example of this same dynamic, let's have a look at Dave Grohl of the Foo Fighters, that Nirvana in Kurt Cobain years. Oh, by the way, another road manager of Grateful Dead besides Alan Trist was once a guy by the name of Hank Harrison. He turns out to be the biological father of Courtney Love, Kurt Cobain's partner, and Hank Harrison has accused his own daughter of being complicit in Kurt Cobain's murder, which was dressed up as suicide, but clearly wasn't. Anyway, back to Grohl, who was once in Nirvana as the drummer. And let's have a look at his old man, shall we? So, James Harper Grohl worked in politics as an assistant to Robert A. Taft Jr. Robert's father was William Howard Taft, the 27th President of the United States, and his father was Alphonso Taft, a founder of the Skull and Bones occult secret society operating out of Yale University. During John Kerry's presidential campaign in 2004, Dave Grohl joined the trail and dedicated the album In Your Honor to the former Skull and Bones man. You can't get much more rock and roll than that, right? A story I've told 1,000 times and I never get tired of it. Meet the Copelands. So the patriarch of this particular family was a legend in military intel circles. He was a guy by the name of Miles Axe Copeland. He was a career CIA guy. He had postings all around the world. He had 3 sons, all of whom were born in Beirut, a major CIA stronghold, and they all got put to use in the music industry. So, from the left, we have Ian Copeland, now deceased. In the middle, you might recognise Stuart Copeland, the drummer with the group The Police. And over on the right is Miles Copeland Jr. So, between them, they had an absolute stranglehold on the punk and new wave scene of the 1970s and beyond. So they had a record label, a booking agency, they managed many of the bands, they had a show on MTV where they would only showcase artists signed to their own roster, and they liked to drop the odd joke, the odd clue here and there, it seems. They like to have a bit of a laugh with it. So their holding company was known as Copeland International Artists, or CIA for short. And they also had a booking agency which they called Frontier Booking International. They had a record label called International Records Syndicate. And then, of course, there was their house band, The Police, meaning they were there to police all the other acts on the scene. So you could not be successful in those genres unless you went through the Copelands. And that's The Police with Sting, by the way, as in a sting operation. What's a sting operation? It's one that you never see coming and it takes you by surprise. Here's Stuart Copeland flashing up a very familiar hand signal. We find this with all famous people. That is the Baphomet horned hand sign. It's one of metal signalling methods to let you know what they're a part of. We'll be seeing many more of these as we go along. Let's move on to Bono, if we must. Bono always sounds to me like the name of a pet dog. Here, Bono, come on, boy, come on. And sure enough, you know, he acts like a little poodle, he's a little lap dog, he's a little errand boy, a bagman for the Illuminati, you know, so he gets thrown the odd dog biscuit from time to time, you know, for a job well done. So here he is hanging out with the likes of Bill Gates, Tony Blair, Bill Clinton, George Bush, Obama, you know. So here's a question. If Bono is just a rock singer, what's he doing hobnobbing with the likes of these? Not that you want to like, but just asking the question. Well, the answer is that Bono is rather more than just a rock singer. This is him doing his real work, pushing New World Order agendas, helping to advance the United Nations Agenda 2030 and associated schemes. And it's all to do with the family that he comes from. This is Barbara Hewson. She was an Irish lawyer, and her main claim to fame was that she campaigned for the age of consent for adults to be able to have sex with children to be lowered to 13. Sadly, she passed away in January 2021. I'm sure we're all very sad. But Bono's real name is Paul David Hewson, and he turns out to be a cousin of Barbara Hewson, according to this researcher, Johnny Vedmore. So this is an illustration of how different members of the same family bloodline are put to use in different prominent roles in society, where they can have an influence on large numbers of people. So in Bono's case, he had to become famous as a... And sure enough, you know, he acts like a little poodle, he's a little lapdog, he's a little errand boy. About Bill Gates, Tony Blair, just a rock singer, like, this is him doing his real work with the family that he comes from. This is Barbara Hewson. She was an Irish lawyer. To be lowered to 13 is Paul David Hewson, according to this researcher, Johnny Vedmore. So this is an illustration of how different members of the same family bloodline are put to use in different prominent roles in society, where they can have an influence on large numbers of people. So in Bono's case, he had to become famous as a singer in a rock group before his real work could become apparent, and before he could build a fan base that he could then take along with him. And in her case, well, it speaks for itself. And we get into the realm here of lifetime actors. This is a term that was coined by the author and researcher Joseph Atwill. A lifetime actor is someone who is thought of as maybe a rock singer or a Hollywood actor, a TV star, politician, anyone in the public eye, and they're thought of in that regard. But the truth of the matter is that they're actually there to push agendas which enable these New World Order master plans to continue. And they operate under the cover of whatever their role is perceived to be. And a lifetime actor's work is never done, which is why they continue to get put out there decade after decade, and whatever the flavour of the month is in terms of things that are getting pushed, they're their job. What we have here is a brief piece of footage of a U2 concert from just the other week at the new Sphere venue in Las Vegas. And look at what's getting flashed up on the screen. It's all subliminal messages targeted directly at the sub-harvesting occult rituals. We see this with things that have become mass energy harvesting occult rituals. We see this with things like the US Super Bowl show, the Grammys, the MTV VMAs, even the Eurovision Song Contest. Now, these are all about getting inside the subconscious minds of large numbers of people and affecting them with certain messages. Here's Bono flashing up another very familiar signal. It's the so-called 666 sign. Don't know if you've noticed, but that number does tend to crop up rather a lot in this style of research. 666 is absolutely loved by the dark occultists who run these institutions. So that's one of these hand signals that you see all these celebrities doing. I'm not going to demonstrate them by doing them myself, because somebody's going to freeze frame the footage, put it online, and say, I told you Devlin was a Satanist. So I just describe them. So there's Bono demonstrating it. He's there with his old pal Sting. And speaking of Sting, here he is in esteemed company with Mark Knopfler of Dire Straits, Sir Paul McCartney, or Billy Shears, Sir George Martin, and Sting giving it a very familiar sign, with his hand inside his jacket in exactly the same way as we saw with Lennon and McCartney, indicating that Sting is very much part of the club. They know, a favourite meme. Yep, these days we do. More of Geldof in part 2, yeah. But for now, we'll just mention that he is a KBE, which means a Knight of the British Empire. How's that work then, when he's an Irishman? Well, he's only half Irish when it comes down to it. He's actually part Jewish on the side of his maternal grandmother. But he's obviously very beloved of the British establishment, and for good reason, because he's a lifetime actor, he's an agenda pusher, and evidently he's quite high up in the pecking order of things. So Geldof became famous initially as the singer with the Boomtown Rats. I do find it tends to help if you're going to be the singer in a band, if you can actually sing. But it doesn't seem to have held him back. But it doesn't matter, because that was just a way of getting him known to the general public, to become a household name, so that when his real work began, everyone would know who he is. And his real work consisted of the Band Aid and Live Aid projects of the mid-1980s. What they were all about was laying the foundations early on, getting a head start for what we're seeing come to fruition now with great speed. The New World Order Master Plan, the United Nations Agenda 2030, that was all about getting into Africa, mass vaccinating African populations, plundering the resources of the land, and getting infrastructure into place, all under the guise of famine relief. One thing that always struck me as very strange is when I think back to that Band Aid record in 1984, of all years, many of the musicians who were on that song, Do They Know It's Christmas, said things like, well, the phone rang and it was Bob Geldof, and he said, you're on this record, get your ass in the studio Sunday, you're going to be there. And you don't say no to Bob Geldof. That's what they said. Well, why not? If Geldof's just some scruffy ruffian from some Irish New Age band out of Dublin, you know, why don't you say no to him? Well, it seems that they knew he was rather more than that. He was more important than that. He called Boy George back from New York. Boy George had been out on a bender and got totally wasted on the Saturday night, and Geldof sent a Concorde over to collect him, and Boy George got forced to come back to London to be on the record, which is why he looks so bloody rough in the video. But, you know, Geldof clicks his fingers and they all come running. Anyway, more of him in part 2, as I say. As I've already alluded to, family bloodlines become very important. Ancestry, DNA, things of this nature. It explains why so many people become famous. Here's another example. This is Esther Dawson, better known as Jinx Dawson. She was the front woman of a group called Coven. They had an album out in the psychedelic era, the late 1960s, called Witchcraft Destroys Minds and Reaps Souls. It's a lovely album, you know, nice music. I'll play it to the kids. And on the back of the album sleeve, you have an actual satanic black mass being pictured. So who is Jinx Dawson? And what's she doing in a band like that? Well, in her own words from an interview, she stated, "I'm of the Mayflower Society, a direct descendant of John Howland, 13th signatory to the Mayflower Compact. Members of my family were also active in Freemasonry." There's a surprise. "My father was a 33rd degree Scottish Rite Mason, and my grandfather, a former Lieutenant Governor of Indiana, was High Priest of the Royal Arch Masons. My great-grandfather was in the private circle of US President Teddy Roosevelt, and we are listed in the book, The First Families of America, so I'm steeped in American Illuminati." She said it. Mike Williams often speaks of what he calls a Cinderella fairy story, and he talks about this with regard to the Beatles. The Cinderella fairy story with the Beatles was that there were 4 regular working class lads from Liverpool, put together a band, and just happened to become the biggest band in the world. You know, just happened, just like that. Could happen to anyone. And we get this punted around all the time. Cover stories to explain where people came from and how they became famous, to conceal the truth of the matter. Here's an example from Madonna. In her own words, "I went to New York, I had a dream. I wanted to be a big star. I didn't know anybody. I wanted to dance. I wanted to sing. I wanted to do all those things. I wanted to make people happy. I wanted to be famous. I wanted everybody to love me. I wanted to be a star. I worked really hard and my dream came true." Because that's all you need to do, folks. Just never stop wanting it. Cross those fingers for good luck, and you too could be as big as Madonna. You couldn't. And you wouldn't want to be either. And by the way, we were getting a very early clue in this picture as to where she came from with the design on the back of her jacket. This is from the movie Desperately Seeking Susan, and we can see an Illuminati pyramid with a capstone at the top containing an all-seeing eye. In 1985, very few people would have known what that meant. These days, we can know better. So, who's Madonna related to? When Lady Gaga came out a few years ago, people were saying things like, "Oh, she reminds me of Madonna when she first emerged." Yeah, they're cousins. That will be why. Not only that, Madonna is also cousins with Ellen DeGenerate, the chat show host. Also related to Justin Trudeau.
Here we go. Now, look at this.
8th cousin, 1 time removed. This is all coming down through the mother's bloodline. The mother's ancestry is so often important, as we saw with Yoko Ono. So Madonna's mother was named Madonna Louise Fortin. She had the same first 2 names. She was French Canadian, and she was connected to all these people, including Trudeau. Also, it turns out, she's a cousin of Camilla, the wife of Lord Sausage Fingers, as he's come to be known. I can't take the term King Charles seriously, so his new nickname is Lord Sausage Fingers, which is a term coined by a good friend of mine, Lance, who does a show called Rise Above TV. That's really taken off, you know, as a phrase back home in England. Also, there's a couple of great lads called Sheep Farm Studios. Anyone listen to Sheep Farm? Yeah, a few of you. Couple of Yorkshire guys They do a great podcast. Love them. Dom and Chris, full of Yorkshire humour, northern humour. They do great research, but they have a laugh with it. You know, crack a few jokes because, after all, the world is so utterly absurd and ridiculous that sometimes you do have to laugh at it. And they've popularised a few terms as well. So for vaccines, because every time they would mention vaccine on YouTube, the video would get taken down by AI, they coined the term arm spear. So they just talk about arm spears. Or they say, been to a Britney Spears concert, you know. Yeah, they've been Britney'd. And their other term is the 3-dart finish. It's something that comes out of the game of darts. You know, you have a 3-dart finish. And many people have these days. 3 darts and you're finished. More genealogy. This is based around Village Idiot Bush. He's the centre of this one. And this was done by professional genealogists. And they've linked all these people. So they've revealed that Bush is a cousin of his own Vice President, Dick Cheney. He's also a cousin of his own political opponent in the 2004 American general election, John Kerry. They both went to Skull and Bones at Yale. So in 2004, American voters were being asked, who do you want to be your next president? This Skull and Bones cousin or this Skull and Bones cousin? Isn't democracy great? Imagine living in a dictatorship where your leaders were served up to you and you had no choice in the matter. Thank God for free choice. Land of the free, home of the slave. So also connected to Bush, we have Marilyn Monroe. Diana, Princess of Wales, is in there. Celine Dion, who's a cousin of Madonna. Brad Pitt's in there. Tom Hanks is in there. They're descended from Abraham Lincoln. Bush is a cousin of Barack Obama. It's one big incest fest. Another dynamic that we should address when it comes to entertainment, popular culture, and what it's really used to achieve is the phenomenon of predictive programming. So this is a term that was coined by the late Scottish researcher Alan Watt. And I've got a brief bit of audio excerpt here of Alan Watt explaining further the idea of predictive programming. He's no longer with us, but he did used to speak in a bit of a monotone. But try and listen to the information that he's putting across because it tells us a lot.
It's almost like coupling an idea with the drama, and it's downloaded like a virus into your subconscious, and you're being programmed, and it's called predictive programming. The technique is ancient, and it's an old science. Plato, in his Republic, talks about the culture industry of his own day, and how it was essential not only for maintaining control over the people by the elite, but that they had to control everything that was given to the public. In other words, anything the public saw in drama on stage was authorized.
So there are 3 main reasons given for why predictive programming gets done. One is to establish a familiarity with the narrative in the minds of the public, so that when the real world event is announced, there's already a recognition of it buried deep in the subconscious mind. Another is down to the idea that energy flows where attention goes, and that we are the co-creators of our own experienced reality down to the consciousness that we apply to a situation. So if we get a depiction of a particular event presented in the form of a movie or a TV show, and there are millions of people around the world giving their attention to it, they can actually help empower that event to come into being by focusing on it. And the third reason comes down to metaphysical, spiritual belief systems. And the occultists recognize the existence of karma, or what we might call karmic retribution. They realize that there is cause and effect in creation, consequentialism, and that if you put harm into the world, you reap appropriate consequences for it. So they try to put the emphasis for what they do away from them onto us. In their sick, twisted, diseased mindset, to not say no is as good as saying yes. So they try to get our tacit approval for what they plan to do by pre-announcing it symbolically, cryptically, and then when we voice no objection, they take that as us saying we're okay with it. Yes, it's sick, yes, it's diseased, but these are sick, diseased abominations that we're talking about. The best example we have of predictive programming in action comes from the events of 9/11. Construction on the World Trade Center towers began in 1968, and they were brought down in a mass occult ritual 33 years later in 2001. 33 being a number that figures heavily in Freemasonry and is very big within occult belief systems. In that year, Stanley Kubrick had his landmark movie 2001: A Space Odyssey released. And that movie prophesied some world-changing event happening 33 years into the future, and it's right there in the title, 2001. Examples of predictive programming pertaining to 9/11 can be found decades before the event. In this edition of Newsweek magazine from 1967, David Rockefeller, that nice man, was pictured on the cover. It was noted that he was wearing a wristwatch, and the hand of the watch was set to the 9 and the 11. And many researchers believe that those towers were constructed for the specific purpose of them being brought down in a Masonic occult ritual 33 years into the future. Yes, it's diseased. Yes, it's diseased, and is very big within occult belief. World-changing event predictive programming pertaining to 9/11 can be found decades before the event. In this edition of Newsweek,
This seems very palatable. Very palatable.
magazine from 1967, David Rockefeller, that nice man, was pictured on the cover. It was noted that he was wearing a wristwatch, and the hands on the watch were set to the 9 and the 11. And many researchers believe that those towers were constructed for the specific purpose of them being brought down in a Masonic occult ritual 33 years into the future. There's no shortage of examples of movies, TV shows and cartoons. The Simpsons certainly have previous in this when it comes to depictions of what we saw on September 11th, 2001, and these go back decades before that event. Examples from the music world include this album from the rap group The Coup. They put out party music in June of 2001, so 3 months before the events. And what we see on the cover is the World Trade Center towers exploding in exactly the same way as we were shown on September 11th, whatever you think really happened that day. Down the front, you've got the leader of that group pressing a remote control detonator, strongly suggesting that those towers came down in a controlled demolition. A real classic comes from this one. The British group Supertramp put out an album in 1979 titled Breakfast in America. On the cover, you've got a breakfast tray laid out to look like the Manhattan skyline. You've got a waitress delivering orange juice, dressed up like the Statue of Liberty, and it's a view from an aeroplane window. If you do a mirror image reversal of that sleeve, after all, we live in a satanically inverted society, right? This is what you find. Now, instead of the U and the P above those towers, you have what looks like a 9 and an 11. And bear in mind, this is a view from an aeroplane window over New York at breakfast time. Seems to me somebody was in the know. Here's a clip from a YouTube video. I'm sorry, I've got to do it. It illustrates the point. So, for no apparent reason, at the start of the video, you get a view of the World Trade Center towers at night. They don't bear any relation to the content of the song, except it's worth noting the title, The Unforgettable Fire. When it comes to Prince, he becomes an extremely complex character to study. He seemed to embrace duality. So he was two things at once. He used to embrace his masculine side, his feminine side. There were times where it felt as if he was completely under the control of the Illuminati power system. But there were other times where it felt like he was trying to communicate great truths, such as when he started talking about chemtrails on a US TV chat show. And it's really difficult to know what to make of him, even down to whether his reported death was a real event or not. I mean, I go into all of this stuff in great detail in my books and in other presentations. I've got a whole talk titled Dark Occult Aspects of Prince, which goes on for about 3 hours. That's online for anyone that wants to have a deeper dive into him. But I'm just throwing him in here because we've got this excerpt from a concert performance in Utrecht in the Netherlands from December 1998 to throw into the mix, considering foreknowledge of 9/11. Have a listen to this recording of the end of this particular concert.
I gotta go back to America. I gotta go get ready for the bomb. I'm talking baby, I'm getting ready to bomb. I'm talking baby, I'm getting ready to bomb. You better watch out.
So bearing in mind that was 1998, it was a little under 3 years before the events of 9/11, and he's talking about Osama bin Laden getting ready to bomb. I mean, he didn't do it, but the point is the public was being asked to believe that he was behind the events of 9/11, and then one of the band members calls out 2001, so he pinpoints the year exactly. 2016 was a very unlucky year for musicians, it would seem. So Prince died, we're told, on the 21st of April that year, the Queen's birthday. Just a coincidence. At the start of the year, we're told that David Bowie passed away. More of him shortly. And at the end of the year, we were told George Michael turned up dead in bed on Christmas Day. You know, like you do. So a man best known for singing the lines, "Last Christmas I gave you my heart," turns up dead on Christmas Day of heart failure. There seems to have been quite a lot of predictive programming pertaining to the death of George Michael. I detail a lot of it in Musical Truth Volume 2, and infuriatingly, my copies of it didn't turn up in time for this gig. I've got volumes 1 and 3, but no bloody volume 2. So, yes, fate is not on my side there. But anyway, there are many movies and many TV shows which seem to contain references to George Michael being dead or about to die. It's all very strange. It's almost as if it was pre-planned. Here's one such example. It's from a movie titled Keanu, and this character goes into this sort of alternate reality, this out-of-body experience, has this hallucinogenic sort of experience, and he goes into this sort of heavenly realm, and this is what he sees.
George Michael. You're George Michael, man.
All very strange. Let's go stranger still. So, as I mentioned, at the start of 2016, the world received the news that David Bowie had passed away. The day after, Sky News ran the story, and they wheeled out an individual by the name of Jack Stephen. He was said to be a music industry executive who had worked with David Bowie, even though nobody had ever heard of him. So they chatted to him on this Sky News bulletin. You used to be able to get this interview everywhere on the net. It was all over the place. It's very difficult to find now. It's been all but scrubbed. So I've got this copy, which is a bit lacking in quality, but I think it still makes the meet Jack Stephen.
I was just saying earlier that I actually felt that part of me had died. I mean, I have to say that's how much of an influence he has been to me and to thousands of millions of people around the world.
Does he remind you of anyone? So, opinion is divided as to whether that could actually be Bowie in disguise. It's worth noting what he says. He says, when I first heard the news, it's like a little piece of me had died. Michael Jackson hears a young Michael giving it the 666 sign, indicating that from early childhood, he was inducted into the SICK entertainment system. So we got the news of Jackson dying on the 20th of June 2000, George Michael's birthday. George Michael died on the 20th of December, exactly 6 months after his birthday. So the 25th of June is known by Satanists as anti-Christmas, because real Christmas in December is symbolizing the winter solstice, it's astrotheology, it's the symbolic death of the sun. So after the 21st of December, it's seen, at least in what's said to be the northern hemisphere, to go to its lowest point in the sky 3 days, and then it rises on the morning of the 25th and slowly begins its journey back to its apex at the summer solstice. In this part of the world, it would be the other way round. So I guess your Christmas would be the 25th of June from that perspective. But interestingly, George Michael died exactly 6 months after his birthday, and it was 10 years to the day after James Brown turned up dead on Christmas Day of 2006. But anyway, in 2009, we got the news of Michael Jackson, and when this was announced, there was a show with Larry King on CNN. I'm just going to turn the volume down slightly because this one is quite loud. Where are we? You could probably do it there, Andrew. So they wheeled out this character who was introduced as Dave. Anyone seen this one? Okay, let's recap. Meet Dave.
Joining us now here in Los Angeles, Miko Brando, who was with us almost every night after this untimely passing, longtime Michael Jackson friend attending the funeral, and Dave, yes, that's his name, Dave. He was David Rothenberg. He was set on fire in 1983, suffered, as you can see, terrible scars. Michael Jackson befriended him and paid for a lot of his surgeries. Dave is also attending the burial. Why Dave?
Well, to liberate myself from the confines of my father's criminality.
He caused the fire?
Yeah. He is a criminal, and he caused all this. To free myself of his name and his legacy, I decided to become my own person through changing my name.
Could it be? Could it? The voice is very similar. Many feel that that could be Michael in disguise. So I don't think you can apply a blanket statement to these events and say with certainty that every time an artist is said to have died, that it's a hoax and they're allowed to go off and live out their remaining years under some assumed identity. I do think that some artists are genuinely taken out. I feel that way about John Lennon. I think John Lennon had become a pain in the arse and a thorn in the side of the establishment, and so he had to be got rid of. 5 months after that, they got rid of Bob Marley, or at least Bob Marley succumbed to what had been done to him. He was basically given a form of cancer through a gift of a pair of boots that was given to him by the son of the one-time director of the CIA, William Casey. He turned up with this gift. Bob Marley was a football fan. He put on this pair of football boots, cried out in pain, and when they examined the boots, they found a small length of copper wire coated in some kind of agent which had pierced his toe. And the cover story is that he broke his toe playing football. It turned gangrenous, cancerous, and spread through his body, and that's how he died. But I think the truth of the matter is rather different. So I do feel they take some out. Others I'm not buying. Jim Morrison, we're told, turned up dead in a bathtub in his Paris apartment at the age of 27 in 1971. Not buying that one because of who Jim was and who his father was. That's part of the 27 Club, which is this large number of musicians who turn up dead at the age of 27 in some bizarre circumstance or other. Members of the club include Robert Johnson, the blues musician, Brian Jones of the Rolling Stones, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, so we're told, Ron Pigpen McCulloch of the Grateful Dead, Kurt Cobain, Amy Winehouse, and many others. I don't buy that Elvis Presley died in 1977. I'll just say 3 words about that. 4 actually. Google Pastor Bob Joyce. Okay, that's your homework. Google Pastor Bob Joyce, and we'll leave that one there. And then with others, there's ambiguity. Prince, Michael Jackson, David Bowie, really difficult to say. One thing we do know is that the entertainment industry is far stranger than we ever realized, and is quite clearly not all about harmless fun and entertainment. If you don't see that by now, I don't know what more I can really tell you, but I will be attempting to in part 2, where I'll be going into some Australian artists to help further illustrate the point. So right now, Perth's own, yeah? Perth's favourite son. So at this point, we would break of about 50 or so. I've got some of my books over at the table, which is where I'll be. If anyone wants to come and grab a book, do come and have a chat with me, and I'll see you shortly for part 2. Cheers. Hey folks, okay, well, let's crack on with part 2. This one went down very well in Melbourne, as I'm sure you can imagine. So just before I get into some Australian artists that I want to focus in on, I want to play you a fascinating recording from this guy who went by the name of John Todd, known as John Todd Collins or Lance Collins in some cases. Would anyone in here be familiar with the work of John Todd Collins? Okay, we have just one. Yeah. Okay, so this guy came out of a so-called Illuminati family. He was one of these so-called elite family bloodlines, and he was that rarest of entities. He broke the ranks and became a whistleblower. He actually became a born-again Christian, and he started revealing some of the stuff that he was involved with when he was in the dark occult. He was put to use in the music industry in the 1970s. And in this excerpt, he's relating an anecdote about one of the things that he came to discover or be involved in when it came to how the music industry used to operate in the 1970s. So let's have a listen to this.
One of the closest friends that I got during that time that I obtained was a man named David Crosby. Crosby, Still, Nash and Young. Even the day before Christmas last year, talked with him. I got him away from this witch that he had with him. He told her to go shopping. We were in West Hollywood, and I was witnessing around to people I knew. We went off in this store, and we started talking. I said, David, I'd like to ask you a couple questions. I said, I already know the answers, but I've been gone for 5 years. I'd like to know if certain things are still the way they were when I left. I said, now I have to explain some of this when I'm done, because you're not going to understand it all unless you know something about music. I said, do they still take the master to the temple room? Dave said, yeah. I said, do they still have the coven conjure demons into the master? He said, of course. I said, now, I got to know something. What's the main reason for rock music? He said, come on, Lance, you know what the reason is. I said, please, David, I don't want to guess. Tell me what the main reason is. He says, the same as when you were in, so that we can play spells on people that we couldn't cast spells upon.
All right, so he's talking there about this standard practice that he says there used to be with all the major record labels in the 1970s, where they would all have what was known as an altar room. They would bring the master tape of an album that they were about to release into the public into this room, and then bring in a coven of witches to cast a dark hex upon that recording. And the idea is that then every copy that would be made of that analog tape recording into a vinyl album would carry some of that dark signature energy with it into people's homes. So that's what he says was happening in the 1970s. You can only imagine how much further they would now have taken things, given that music is produced digitally and electronically. And you can now strip frequencies and all kinds of unseen elements into a recording without anyone knowing that they're there when this is done electronically. So, interesting anecdote and fascinating to reflect on how that one may have developed. I want to now get into this idea of trauma-based mind control programming. I made a couple of brief references to this in part one, but I really want to take a deep dive into it now. So early days for me, around about 2008, when I started doing this research in earnest, I came across this resource, Vigilant Citizen, vigilantcitizen.com. The proprietor of it breaks down all the signs and the symbols and the imagery, the icons, the motifs that are used pertaining to satanic ritual abuse and trauma-based mind control programming. This stuff is absolutely everywhere in the entertainment industry. It teaches you how to recognize certain signs and symbols and what they mean. Manly P. Hall once commented, when the human race learns to read the language of symbolism, a great veil will fall from the eyes of men. Vigilant Citizen teaches you how to become symbol literate. Taught me. So, when it comes to mind control, what happens is that many of these stars, these celebrities, are groomed for success from a very early age. And a lot of that happens through the Disney Corporation. Disney comes with its own sort of Cinderella fairy story, cover story, as to what it really is. It's thought of as this nice, family-friendly, wholesome company that's really good entertainment for kids. The truth of the matter is the exact opposite. It's a deeply satanic and evil corporation. It had its Mickey Mouse Club, so-called, which is where young children were groomed for future success and no doubt abused in the process. What we're looking at here is an image of a very young Britney Spears. Behind her is a young Christina Aguilera, and at the top a young Justin Timberlake. So all three of them went on to become famous pop stars. Also coming out of Disney was Miley Cyrus as Hannah Montana before she started on her pop career. And what often happens with the pop princesses like Britney, Christina and Miley is they start out relatively innocent and wholesome. They appeal to young kids. They build up a fan base. Then when the fan base is intact, the act gradually gets more sexualized, sweeps the fans along with them, and then they just blatantly graphic and explicit, like Miley Cyrus with, some of her recent performances. Speaking of symbols and what they mean, we have the Mickey Mouse ears coming out of that particular institution, and they mean something. So when you see celebrities sporting the Mickey Mouse ears, here's Madonna doing the same thing. According to researchers, this symbolizes the very early days of filmmaking in Hollywood, where you would get two spools, reels of film, loaded onto either side of a projector. That's what the ears represent. And what it's suggesting is the dissociation from reality which happens when one of these children is subjected to horrific trauma. So what happens is that the mind breaks, shatters in order to deal with what's being done to it. It dissociates from reality. It leads to what's known as multiple personality disorder or dissociative identity disorder. And it's been discovered that it can create different compartments within the mind, each of which can be programmed with its own unique personality. And these can be brought forward at will by a handler who knows what they're doing by use of a trigger phrase correctly applied. So that's how the trauma-based programming works. Speaking of inversion, as we were, and just staying with Mickey Mouse, there's a reason why Disney uses that particular font. And when it comes to the word Mickey, you can see what happens when you apply a mirror image reversal to it. Various ways of spotting mind-controlled artists. This is Nicki Minaj from a few years back, sporting pink hair, and she's dressed up to look like a Barbie doll. So her nickname was Barbie. Her female fans used to be called Barbs. And whenever you see a female celebrity dressed up as a doll, it's indicating that they've been programmed. It's indicating that they've dissociated. It's indicating that they've been tampered with. In her case, she put out a song called Out of My Head. So they're telling you in blatant terms what's really going on here. In the video, she's wearing a straitjacket and she's in some sort of mental institution. There's a reason why you see so many celebrities pictured with butterflies, particularly when this distinctly orange-coloured monarch butterfly. This applies to monarch programming, which is a derivative of MK Ultra mind control coming out of those nice folks at the CIA. So MK Ultra was this wide-reaching program of mind control developed in the very early days of the CIA when it morphed out of the Office of Strategic Services. In 1953, they began this program, and officially it was wound down in 1973. Yeah, right. All that really happened is that it went underground and off the books, but it's definitely still in operation. There are different divisions of it, and monarch programming is one which is applied to celebrities, famous people. It refers to the monarch butterfly as this is supposed to be a creature which is able to pass on ancestral memories from one generation to another, which is why it was selected to symbolise what goes on here, because reportedly programmed multiples are able to pass on their traumatic memories to their offspring, so it goes on from generation to generation. So here we've got Mariah Carey clutching a monarch butterfly because it's letting you know that she's a programmed monarch. There was this story from 2001 where we were told that Mariah had suffered a nervous breakdown. So she's on stage, she starts babbling incoherently, a handler comes up, leads her off, and Mariah's out of public view for a few months. A while later, she comes back with a new look, a new image, a new album, and she's all ready to go because she's gone back into the lab, she's had her mind control programming topped up, and now she's ready to go out into the public again. So when you hear of celebrities going into rehab, that is a euphemism for going back to the lab to get the programming topped up. When Amy Winehouse spoke of they're trying to make me go to rehab, but I say no, 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 that's what she's referring to. She, by the way, became another member of the 27 Club, turning up dead in 2011 in very suspicious circumstances. A classic example of mind control programming breaking down came from Britney Spears in this interview. This is another one which used to be all over the internet. It's now very difficult to find. It's been all but scrubbed. So I had to jack a copy of it from this guy's website, but you can still get a feel for what's going on here. So she's being interviewed, and there's a point where the host says something to her which appears to be a trigger phrase, and it causes Britney's programming to break down, and she goes elsewhere. She becomes someone else for a few moments before she pulls herself back together and goes back into her front altar. This is her programming breaking down, and this is dissociation in action.
A rough year. You've had a year that would test a lot of people. Illness in the family. A breakup. This spasm of publicity about what happened from Mexico to London.
It was pretty rough, yeah. Yeah, it's kind of weird. Ah, weird. Hello. Oh my goodness. Hello. Ew. Strong Brittany. Yeah, it was a weird time. Ew. I'm embarrassed. Can we stop?
Now, you may also remember the story from 2007 where Britney went crazy and went to a hair salon and shaved off all her hair. And she was making comments like, I've got to get this stuff out of my head. They're not going to control me anymore. And whenever Hollywood or the mainstream media talks of celebrities undertaking these bizarre actions, it's presented as, oh, it's the fame, it's the money, it goes to their heads, it makes them go a bit crazy. No, that's not what it is. We're seeing mind control in action. The mind control experiments coming out of MKUltra were initially conducted out of McGill University in Montreal, Canada, under the directorship of a vicious psychopath, a Scotsman by the name of Dr. Ewan Cameron. There was another very famous MKUltra doctor as well. His name was Dr. Anthony Kidman. And he was the father of Nicole Kidman, So he was engaged in that type of programming, experimentation, until he turned up dead in Singapore in extremely suspicious circumstances himself. This guy's father was also involved in experimental research. We're looking at Syd Barrett, the original man of the group Pink Floyd. So Syd had to be kicked out of the group very early on in 1967, and the official story is that he went a bit crazy because he'd fried his brains by doing too much LSD. I think the truth of the matter lies in the work that his father was engaged with for Cambridge University, where he was engaged in mind control experimentation. A little bit similar to what Dr. Richard Asher was doing. And his name was Max Barrett. And so often the offspring of these people are used as the test subjects, the experimental victims of what they're looking into. Here we've got some symbolism which very strongly addresses mind control. The teddy bears address the loss of childhood innocence, which is achieved when these kids get exposed to this extreme trauma. And whenever you see a mirror frame, you see here the figure of Syd looking back at himself with a creepy ass face mask on. But also when you see shattered mirrors, that's symbolizing the shattering of the mind into these different components, these different alters, which occurs as part of the process. Another derivative and a sort of cousin of monarch programming is known as beta sex kitten programming. And the original archetype for this was Marilyn Monroe, when she was transformed from Norma Jean Baker into the invented persona of Marilyn Monroe. She became the prototype for the beta sex kitten model. The reason it's called that is because they are effectively sex slaves. In her case, she was a presidential model gifted to both Kennedy brothers, and the animal print that they so often come with is symbolizing the animal instincts, the primal base consciousness instincts that they're tapping into, their sexuality, which they're expressing through their programming. The bleach blonde hair look is important because it's another way of recognizing one of these beta sex slaves. And Vigilant Citizen points out that pretty much every major celebrity, particularly when it comes to pop singers, at some point has posed as Marilyn Monroe or has taken her off in some way. Madonna did it with her video to Material Girl, which was a pastiche of Marilyn in the movie Gentlemen Prefer Blondes. There's a clue in the title. So this segues us nicely into our Aussie artist section, where we got Kylie emulating the Marilyn Monroe look, very strongly suggesting that she's a beta sex kitten programmed in the same way. Here she is with that animal print design. Same thing here. And again. And it seems to run in the family. Here's her sister Danny. Same ideas being conveyed. And I think there are some clues in some of Kylie's song titles. Because when it comes to the methods that were used by Dr. Ewan Cameron and many of these other MKUltra doctors to cause their subjects to dissociate, one of the techniques that was used was the application of a spinning sensation. So as well as electroshock treatment, the administering of mind-altering drugs, specifically LSD, and the use of sensory deprivation, tanks and cells where subjects will be put for days on end, causing the trauma, there's this sensation of spinning around. So Kylie had a song titled Spinning Around. We can also factor in her hit Can't Get You Out of My Head, remember what Britney Spears spoke of when she shaved her head and she said, I'm trying to get these things out of my head. Vigilant Citizen has also published a series of drawings from Michael Jackson, which include multiple versions of the same individual, the same face, hinting at dissociation and multiple personalities, but also drawings where you have these people with sort of electrodes and wires coming out of their heads. This seems to be a big part of mind control as well. So we got the song Can't Get You Out My Head. And then one of those methods of programming includes the electroshock, and Kylie had a song called Shocked. And bring it right up to date, her most recent hit from just a few weeks ago sees her pictured with her eye being covered. This is one of these Illuminati calling card signs. It goes hand in hand with the pyramids, the 666 sign, and all the others. The covering of one eye. Pretty much every famous person has been pictured doing this pose. It's referencing the all-seeing eye, the Eye of Horus, the Eye of Providence, so-called, and it's just one of these calling cards of these occult secret societies, letting you know that this is one of theirs. Kylie was in a romantic relationship for a time with Michael Hutchence of INXS. According to this story, she was the inspiration for the INXS record Suicide Blonde. This brings us into the Michael Hutchence story, and it's one which involves Paula Yates, who was a British music journalist and television presenter. Note that she's rocking that same dyed blonde hair look as she did throughout her career, suggesting that she's another beta sex kitten. And here she is with Michael Hutchence. So she got into an affair with him after they were involved in a TV interview. They were both flirting outrageously with each other, and it was very clear that there was an attraction between them. Now, prior to getting with Michael Hutchence, Paula Yates was with Bob Geldof. So for many years, Paula was in this relationship with Geldof, and then the relationship evidently started breaking down, and she got into this affair with Michael Hutchence. Evidently, this didn't go down too well with Bob Geldof. Michael Hutchence turned up dead in a Sydney hotel room on the 22nd of November. There's that date again. 22 plus 11 equals 33, that important occult number. It's also the anniversary of the Kennedy assassination, and this was in 1997. Very suspicious circumstances, lots of anomalies surrounding it. There were people in the room next door who say that they heard sounds of a disturbance or an argument taking place. The official verdict is that he committed suicide, but not many are buying that. Particularly Michael's family. So his father, Kelland, told Australian TV that Bob Geldof had been intimidating Hutchence and Yates in his attempts to gain custody of Tiger Lily, the daughter they had together. Geldof began his actions after opium was found in Hutchence's property while he was out of the country. Very convenient, in what many believe was a setup. Kelland stated he made their lives miserable. It's like he was on a vendetta. I think it contributed very much to what happened. Kelland remarked that his son had had an argument over the phone with Geldof just hours before he died. Paula Yates herself told the UK's Daily Express, Bob Geldof murdered Michael Hutchence. That bastard killed Michael. He's called Saint Bob. That makes me sick. He killed my baby. We've had 3 years of this. She also claimed that Geldof had frequently threatened Hutchence and herself by saying, "Don't forget, I'm above the law." A comment similar in nature to what Jimmy Savile used to say when challenged. Jimmy Savile was very fond of saying, "Don't forget who I am." Geldof evidently was someone who had protection from above, not talking about from the Most High, but from above in the pyramid of power, and felt that he could do whatever he wanted. So we fast forward to September 2000, and Paula Yates turns up dead, aged 41, officially of a heroin overdose. The very next day, Bob Geldof filed for custody of Tiger Lily, even though he's not related to her in any way. Hutchins's family objected to this, but said they were not given Geldof's permission to join the custody proceedings. They also objected to Geldof's attempts to legally change her surname to his. A compromise was reached, whereby she's now known as Tiger Hutchins Geldof. And we should also mention what happened to Peaches Geldof, the daughter that Bob Geldof had with Paula Yates. She turned up dead herself of an overdose a couple of years after her mother. The story with her is that, as well as being a member of the OTO, the Ordo Templi Orientis, which is one of these secret society mystery schools, which Aleister Crowley once headed, she was about to reveal the identities of the mothers who had given up their infant children to be sexually abused by Ian Watkins, the lead singer with the Welsh group The Lost Prophets. So right before she was due to reveal that information, she turns up dead. And that puts me in mind of the story with Chris Cornell and Chester Bennington, who were both evidently about to release information about pedophilia and child sex trafficking, which goes on within the entertainment realms. And then we hear that both of them just decide to take their own lives. In Chris Cornell's case, in a hotel room, just like Hutchins in Detroit, and Chester Bennington at his home on Chris Cornell's birthday. So Patricia Glasser claimed in 2007 that Geldof had been preventing her from seeing her granddaughter and branding him Satan. I wish she'd get off the fence and say what she really thinks. And very cruel. She claimed he was only interested in raising Tiger for the inheritance she would receive from her father's estate when she came of age. What we have here is an image from the J-pop industry out of Japan. And it's a group giving it the old Illuminati pyramid symbols. And throughout J-pop, you'll find examples of the prominent artists doing exactly the same signs and symbols that you find with the American acts and all the British acts. Same thing with K-pop out of Korea, exact same signs and symbols. So if that's the case in all these other nations, why would anyone expect it to be any different in Australia? It's not like they would let this nation off the hook when it comes to who gets selected to be the most prominent artists. So Nick Cave, a very sly 666 sign being done here, in more familiar sort of gothic, macabre makeup, as was his general look. Evidently, he was liked by the establishment because he was made an officer of the Order of Australia. So that seems to be the equivalent of an MBE or an OBE or a Sirhood. He complains that he was extremely bored at Lord Sausagefinger's historic coronation. Why attend then? And how did he get an invite in the first place? You know, why? If he's just some random Australian music maker, you know, why'd you get an invite to a party like that? Not that you want to go. Nick Cave says Queen Elizabeth was the most charismatic woman I have ever met. I think he needs to get out more. This is his wife, Susie, and she herself is into some rather questionable symbolism. She's got a brand called The Vampire's Wife. It's all very dark and gothic. This is some artwork that Nick has created. Devil as a child, and devil returns from the war. Lovely, heartwarming. Then we've got the tragic story of his son, Arthur, one of twins, and he fell to his death from cliffs in southern England. So the Cave family based themselves in England, London, and then later Brighton on the south coast. It was these cliffs from which his son fell. And we're told that it was after he'd taken LSD and he believed he could fly. So he was 15 years of age. He was one of twins. His twin brother, Earl Cave, has gone on to achieve some success as an actor. And this is a dynamic that we've seen elsewhere, where the twins of a celebrity, where one dies, the other one goes on to achieve some success. And it brings in this very disturbing and very unsettling suggestion of ritual sacrifices taking place in exchange for fame and fortune. Unfortunately, my research bears out that this is a very real dynamic. It does go on. Many of these famous people are required to put up family members for sacrifice in order to further their careers. There are many examples in my books. Many other researchers have gone into this as well. And he wasn't the only of Nick Cave's sons who's died. Another one was Jethro Lee, biological son of Nick Cave, who died aged 31. No official cause of death given, although it was strongly hinted that it was another of those overdoses. Overdoses and death by bathtub. You can get away with so much with those ones. Pretty much every major group that's achieved any modicum of mainstream success has lost one of its prominent members before their time. When you think about it, this really does apply to most bands. With the Beatles, they lost their original bassist, Stuart Sutcliffe, in 1962, right before they burst through to fame at the ripe old age of 21. And then he was replaced on bass by Paul McCartney, the real one. So pretty much every major group has lost a prominent member before their time. And this brings in AC/DC, another very well-known sort of joint British-Australian band. So you had the Young Brothers, originally from Scotland, and also this guy, known as Bon Scott, original name Ronald Belford Scott. And he turned up dead, aged 33, go figure, in 1980 in London in, again, suspicious circumstances. So it seems to have been chalked up as some sort of overdose. In some accounts, it's an alcoholic overdose. In other accounts, it's drugs. It's all very unclear and very ambiguous. But either way, another major member of a prominent group dies before their time. Let's talk about Sia, the Australian artist, Sia Furler, out of Adelaide. So this is how she appears in public, wearing a wig which covers her face. She ticks all the boxes for having been a trauma-based mind control subject. She's probably best known for writing hits for other artists, but she's also had plenty of her own. So I think we get a clue in some of her record titles as to what she's been through. This one's called 1000 Forms of Fear. Fear and trauma is key to so much of this programming. Here's another version of that album with a different image. This one's called Healing is Difficult. This one's called Alive, but we've got some duality sort of imagery creeping in. It's all quite dark. Gets even darker with this one called This is Acting. And when you think about it, these dissociated monarch subjects are acting when they go into these different roles, these different alters. It can be said to be acting. because it's escaping from reality. We are born with some suspect stuff going on. This one, you've changed, 2 different versions of her. There's those Illuminati all-seeing eyes on her face, and there's 2 altars going on there, and she can definitely be said to have changed. Then in the big song that she had with David Guetta, Titanium, on the cover she's got one eye concealed in exactly the same way as we see with so many other artists, another of those calling cards. And her life has not been a happy one. Much of it seems to revolve around what happened to this guy, Dan Pontifex, who was her boyfriend. So she based herself in London for some time. When she was away in Thailand, she got a message that her boyfriend, Dan, had died when he'd been hit by a London taxi. She came back to Australia, and then she got called by a bunch of her friends in London saying, come back over, attend his funeral, and, just hang out with us, we'll look after you. So she went back to London, and she got into drink and drugs, and basically ended up on a 7-year bender, addicted to all of it. Not only that, but according to this biography, she has experienced depression and addiction to painkillers and alcohol. In 2010, she wrote a suicide note planning to overdose, and a friend unintentionally saved her life. She joined Alcoholics Anonymous. She has cited extreme lethargy and panic attacks. She stated she has Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. She's also been diagnosed with complex post-traumatic stress disorder stemming from childhood traumas involving being sexually abused at the age of 9, and with autism. Sia had said that following the backlash she received regarding her film music, she relapsed, became suicidal again, and returned to rehabilitation. She was married to a filmmaker named Eric Anders Lang, but that one didn't last. Did a documentary with Louis Theroux where she's talking about working through some complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And then when it comes to her sexuality, it seems there's some agenda pushing going on here. So she got into a relationship with J.D. Samson. This is J.D. Samson. Apparently a biological female, so we're told. Looks like a dude to me, but what do I know anymore in 2023? But nevertheless, that's what's going on. Sia has said that she's queer, and she said, I've always dated boys and girls and anything in between. So it seems to me that she's a very troubled soul. She's had a wretched life, and what we're seeing here is her assisting in the pushing of an agenda. So when it comes to taking drugs, for example, going back to that 60s scene, if anyone at the time was taking LSD as a personal informed decision and it was harming no one else, then there's no problem. It's a personal choice and they're free to make it. It only becomes a problem when it's an agenda. The same thing goes to lifestyle and sexuality choices. People are free to explore their sexuality in any way they choose. And as long as it's a personal free will decision, it's not a problem, so long as it causes harm to no one else. But when you're coerced into doing this, that's when it becomes a problem, because it's an agenda. The master propagandist Edward Bernays, who wrote the book Propaganda in 1928 and is credited with inventing the concept of public relations because he understood psychology, stated in that book, we are governed, our tastes moulded, our ideas formed, largely by men we've never heard of. That dynamic remains as true in 2023 as it did in 1928 when those words were first written. So he's talking about how people have ideas formed for them without their conscious knowledge. So now we've got girls who are saying that they want to be boys and vice versa. And these decisions are not coming from them themselves. It could be argued they're too young to even make that kind of informed decision. It's an agenda. They're being coerced into thinking this way. And that's when it becomes a problem. What we're seeing here is one such agenda being promoted and an asset being used to achieve it. Newton-John, British, Australian. Would it surprise you to learn that her father was an MI5 agent, British military intelligence? He worked at Bletchley Park, code breaking, these codes put out by the Nazis in World War II. And she also turns out to be a cousin of Ben Elton, the famous comedian. So once again, it's all about the family bloodlines. Dr. Kathleen Athol Hockey, she's into genetics, frequently referred to as the mother of medical genetics in Western Australia. She pioneered clinical genetic services that either identified a child's existing hereditary condition or warned expectant women about the inherited health risks facing their unborn child. So it's one whisker away from eugenics, population reduction, Planned Parenthood and all that good stuff. Why is she important? Because she turns out to be the mother of Dave McComb of the group the Triffids. So what are the chances of the offspring of somebody into this sort of thing being a rock star? Well, actually, we see it all the time. And particularly in the punk and new wave genre, you find endless examples through the parents of this kind of activity. You never find parents of rock stars who are plumbers, labourers, lorry drivers, or builders. Just doesn't happen. Tones and I had to mention her. Talking about Australian artists, right? So, real name Toni Watson. I've only thrown her in there because, well, Dance Monkey? Really? I mean, you know, what is that all about? Is that a human voice? Yeah. Is that music? And the question I want to ask is, how believable is her cover story? So we're told she spent 2018 living between the home of this guy, a music lawyer, Jackson Walton Brown, between his home on the Gold Coast hinterland and her van in Byron Bay, writing music and busking full time. Later in the year, she won the Battle of the Buskers at Buskers by the Creek. So we're asked to believe that she became famous and had a worldwide hit as a result of busking. Yeah, because that really happens, right? We get the same thing in Britain with Ed Sheeran, believe it or not. We're told that, oh yeah, Ed was out there on the streets and he was busking for years and he just happened to get discovered and he just happened to become a major star. No, that's not how it happened. Ed Sheeran's father has connections to the United Nations and he's also a close personal friend of Lord Sausage Fingers. That's why Ed Sheeran is famous, not because he was a great busker. Back to Rolf. Why would you tie a kangaroo down? I don't understand. Is this an Austrian thing? I mean, never understood that song. Maybe it's coded. But anyway, I'm sure we all know the story of Rolf. He spent most of his time living in England and he got awarded with a gong. He was a big favourite of the Queen. Close personal friend of this guy. Of course he was, because they were into the same stuff. Rolf became exposed as a paedophile, and he got charged with these offences and went to jail for it, now deceased, of course. And these two both came with their own cover stories. So Jimmy Savile was referred to as a national treasure, and he was always doing charity fun runs, and people used to say, oh, he's such a great guy, he raises all this money for good causes. No, the charity fun runs were his way of getting close to children in hospitals so that he could abuse them. And Rolf had his Rolf's Animal Hospital, where he rescued small fluffy animals, and that made the British public think he was a lovely guy, you know, really nice man, helping out these animals and stuff. The truth of the matter is that he was into some rather different stuff behind the scenes. Here he is hanging out with the Queen. Birds of a feather flock together. So I think we can sum up the entire dynamic of my message this evening in a very simple phrase from the late, great George Carlin.
It's a big club, and you ain't in it.
And neither would you want to be. So they lie to our faces, but tell the truth cryptically for those who are able to decipher the obfuscation. So the nightly news and the proclamations of politicians will be pure deception, and usually a 180-degree inversion of the truth, whereas it's in what we're entrained to think of as fiction or entertainment that the truth so often lies, albeit concealed with layers of symbolism and allegory. When you learn about how lifetime actors and culture creation work, the question becomes, are you happy you were duped and taken into confidence by these people, and would you like more of it? Or are you rather hacked off that you were treated as such easy fodder, rife for manipulation, and now that you understand how the game is played, do you resolve to never be fooled in the same way again? There's no shame in admitting that you were bamboozled. All of us are from the earliest age. The dignity comes from acknowledging that it happened and knowing better for next time. That's where we get the phrase, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Because we're supposed to learn from these lessons. It can be summed up also in some lyrics from arguably one of the most famous rock songs of all time, Stairway to Heaven by Led Zeppelin. I get into the dark side of Led Zeppelin in a separate presentation, but for the purposes of this one, yes, there are two paths you can go by, but in the long run, there's still time to change the road you're on, indicating that everything is a choice. Okay, would you like some good news? So my presentations are sort of 99% doom and gloom and dread, and I save the 1% of optimism right for the end. But there is cause for optimism. It comes simply from the fact that we are now able to have meetings such as this and share information of this nature. I mean, another thing is simply the fact that I'm able to be here right now. I was supposed to be here in March 2020 with expert timing. I picked the 16th of March 2020 to leave the UK to come to Australia. I think we all know why it didn't happen. So 3.5 years later, here I am. But I don't think this was the plan. I don't think the plan was that we would be able to travel freely at this point. I think the only reason we've got a temporary reprieve, and I'm not saying it's all over and nobody knows what's around the corner, and the reason I'm doing this trip now is because I saw a window of opportunity to get here. But I think it's because of all the pushback and all the resistance that people have shown that we've been granted whatever this is, by way of a reprieve. We should be much further into tyranny by now, according to their plans, than we are. And the only reason it's not happened is because people have risen up, especially in this nation, and said, we're not having it. In not enough numbers, we need more, but the resistance has been shown. And the more we demonstrate that, the more clear and direct a message we send back that we can see through the bullshit, we're not buying the lies, and we're not consenting to live in this way. And that goes for this kind of information as well. All this stuff has been secret for a very long time. We're not supposed to know about this stuff. We're now learning how to spot these signs and symbols. We now know how to sniff out a social engineering psyop a mile off. The old mind control tricks aren't working like they used to. The cat is out of the bag, and it's not going back anytime soon. And things are only moving in one direction. More and more information of this nature is coming out. More and more of us are sharing it with anyone that will listen, friends, family members, colleagues. And as long as we all continue to do that and take on that personal and collective responsibility to share this information and reveal the truth of what's really going on in the world, because we can now comprehend exactly what it is, then eventually we're going to get to where we need to be. I don't know how close we are to achieving that. I don't know. It's going to be weeks, months, years, or even in my lifetime. All I know is that we have to continue on this path, and eventually they are going to lose, and we, humanity, are going to take back our sovereignty, our freedom, and live the way we were always intended to. And we will win. Thanks for listening. Thanks very much.
Well, that's the end of that presentation.